In this video, I'd like to go through the female reproductive system organs other than the ovary. So we talked about the ovary in the last video, and we're going to pick it up from there, except I do want to review just a little bit because there are some pictures I didn't show you in the last video that I'd like to start with today. So here is the diagram of the ovary from our book, and I just want to see, if this makes sense to you. So these tiny little follicles that you can see on the outer periphery, those would be primordial follicles. Primordial follicles are the primary oocytes surrounded by the flat follicular cells. But once they perk up, you call that a primary follicle. A primary follicle would be the primary oocyte surrounded by the cuboidal follicular cells. And we know the follicular cells are going to start to grow by mitosis. And once you have more than one layer, those cells, instead of saying follicular cells, you say granulosa cells. And we'd also say that that follicle is a secondary follicle. So here is a secondary follicle, several layers of granulosa cells, primary oocyte in the secondary follicle because it hasn't divided yet, right? It will undergo that first somatic division right before ovulation. So it stays quite a bit as the primary oocyte in the ovary. And the zona pellucida would be surrounding the primary oocyte. We can't see that. Think of folliculi. They're not showing us the supporting layers of the ovary, but I would call this a secondary follicle. I would call this a secondary follicle, and that white ring that you can see around the oocyte, that is a depiction of the zona pellucida, so there we can see that. I would call this, what do you think? I call it this secondary follicle, because these are granulosa cells. We can see the pools of follicular fluid starting to form zona pellucida, primary oocyte, because those pools of fluid have to merge into this one big antrum before we'd say vesicular follicle. And it's the vesicular follicle that will rupture. So it will start to bulge from the surface of the ovary. Here we can see rupture of the vesicular follicle. This is what's known as ovulation, releasing some granulosa cells called the corona radiata, then the zona pellucida, and this would be the secondary oocyte. So somewhere, the primary oocyte is within the vesicular follicle, just prior to ovulation. Actually, the hormone that triggers ovulation is also going to be the hormone that's going to trigger that first somatic division. So this is going to occur right before ovulation. And then the follicular tissue that remains behind survives and thrives as the corpus luteum until eventually it dies off as the corpus albicans. Okay, so I just wanted to take a look at that diagram from the book, and I also wanted to show you some pictures that I took from the slides in our lab. So these are primordial follicles. All these little circular structures. You can see how they cluster together. You can see the single layer of cells surrounding some of these. So that's a primordial follicle. Compare this to, this is a primary follicle. Do you see how much bigger the follicular cells are? And I mean, I see some evidence of maybe, more than one layer, but we're just going to say this is one layer. By and large, it's one layer. So we're going to say this is a primary follicle. You can see the zona pellucida, that kind of bright pink ring, and this whole thing is the primary oocyte. Here's the nucleus of the primary oocyte. So that's a primary oocyte. Here's a secondary oocyte, so we can clearly see multiple layers of granulosa cells. And this is a bigger picture that shows us how, when we look at this slide, you can see all of these stages. You just have to really kind of look around. So I can see the primordial follicles out here. This looks like a primary follicle, secondary follicle. This looks like a vesicular follicle, and it's cut off a little bit there. Here's a close-up picture of the vesicular follicle. Okay, so just a little review there, and I grabbed this picture off the internet. I thought you would be interested in seeing this. So you can see the surface of the ovary in white, and you can see how the follicle is bulging from the surface. And then you can see ovulation is about to occur. So the corona radiata and the contained oocyte are still, contained in the fluid, as you can see. So that is the ovary. So moving on from the ovary, female reproductive tract is made up of internal and external structures. And just taking a look at the diagram from the book, we can see the two ovaries. We've talked about those. there are two uterine tubes, also called fallopian tubes. Okay, so the two uterine tubes are hollow muscular tubes that convey the ovulated oocyte into the uterus. So there's one uterus, muscular organ that basically houses the offspring during development, and then the uterus is continuous with the outside through the vagina, and then the external genitalia surround the vaginal opening. So the way that my notes are organized, and what I'd like to do, is start with the uterine tube and just look at these structures in order, from the uterine tube, uterus, vagina, and external structures. Okay, so to do that, let's pull up the 3D model. You can find it in course resources. Then you can see that's going to open in a new window. And you're going to get a default model to start. So these are gallery views, just in case you pull up the model and you're not sure what you want to look at. You could always use these gallery views. I'm going to close that, and we're going to take a look at reproductive organs, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, so we can see, I'm going to zoom in. Okay, we can see an ovary, and then you can see the uterine tube. Okay, and one thing that you might be able to tell from this is that even though it looks like the uterine tube is touching the surface of the ovary, the two actually don't contact each other. So I think with a little bit of a closer look there, you can see, you know, how those fringe-like structures coming off of the edge of the fallopian tube, those are called fimbriae. Fimbria, singular, fimbriae, plural. And what they do is they're found at the distal end of the fallopian tube, right, the furthest end, where it's going to try to persuade, you know, the ovulated oocyte into the uterine tube. I'm going to turn off the labels just so we can see this better. There we go. Okay, so those are the fimbriae. Those are at the distal end of the tube, and then this kind of ending that's being highlighted, this is known as the infundibulum. I'm going to ghost that just so you can see. So the infundibulum is a little bit like of a funnel-shaped ending, and that's where the oocyte is going to enter into the uterine tube. So if we take a look at the uterine tube, you know, the whole thing, you can see how it gets really wide at the distal end. This is known as the ampulla. Okay, so the ampulla is just, let me make that solid again, is just this wide distal end. The isthmus is where it's a little bit more constricted, it's narrower. And just to ghost that, you can see better what I'm talking about when you look at the actual size of the lumen of the tube. So this is where the oocyte would have to travel to the uterus, and you see how the tube tapers down? That's what's known as the isthmus. So the most narrow region is this medial region, that medial portion of the uterine tube. So in the notes, I go through this. So the uterine tube is just a hollow muscular tube. It extends from the uterus to the ovarian surface, conveys the ovulated secondary oocyte into the uterine cavity, conveys sperm towards the oocyte, and it's inside of the uterine tube where fertilization usually occurs. It usually occurs right at the distal end in the ampulla. So the isthmus, that's that constricted region that I showed you where it attaches to the uterus. The ampulla, that's the dilated region. That's the distal portion of it. The infundibulum is that funnel-shaped ending. And then the fimbriae are the processes that extend from the infundibulum and try to move the ovulated oocyte into the uterine tube. So if you've ever heard of an ectopic pregnancy, which just means that it's a pregnancy that established itself somewhere outside of the uterus, then, you know, logically you might be aware of the fact that it's possible for the ovulated oocyte not to make it into the uterine tube and to just be in the pelvic cavity, or to be contained within the uterine tube. So the uterine tube has 3 layers of tissue. The inner layer that the oocyte would be in contact with, remember this from AP1, right? Simple ciliated columnar epithelial tissue, and the action of the cilia help to move the oocyte. Keep in mind, it's a non-motile cell, so the only reason that it's moving is the cilia, and also the middle layer of the tube is made up of smooth muscle, and then the outer layer of the uterine tube is just the visceral peritoneum, just like we saw over the surface of the ovary, and just like we'll see with the uterus. So both uterine tubes lead into the one uterus, which is a very muscular organ, and the purpose of it is just for the developing offspring to form there. And I'm going to go back to the model and I'll try to show you these regions of the uterus. Okay, so going back to the model, let's zoom out on this. I'm going to use this orientation cube, just put us facing forward. And actually, since I'm doing that, let me just show you this. Do you notice how the uterus is tilting forward? That's known as anteflexion, and that is the typical orientation of the uterus. So even though in the book they show it upright, in over 90% of the population it tilts forward like this, and so that's normal. It can also tilt in the other direction, but it doesn't, you know, stand upright. But to be more like the book, I'm gonna hide some of these structures just so we can get a better view of these parts. Okay, so there's the uterus. This dome-shaped top of the uterus, that's called the fundus. The major portion of the uterus, that's the body. And then about the lower 1/3 of the uterus where it tapers down, this is called the cervix. This area of constriction, just like we saw with the uterine tube into the uterus, this is also known as the isthmus. Okay, so there's the fundus, the body, the cervix. The isthmus is where the organ is tapering in. And then if we, let's ghost these areas just so we can see what's inside. And so what we're seeing is the uterus is hollow. So this is the uterine cavity, that cavity that we can see in there. This is where implantation will take place. We'll talk about that next week. And this canal that's going through the cervical region, this specifically is known as the cervical canal. Okay, so if sperm are deposited in the vagina, then they would enter into, this is called the external os. That's the external opening of the cervical canal. Move through the cervical canal, move through the internal os into the uterine cavity. Okay, so switching over to the notes, the fundus is that superior portion. I showed you that anteflexion. The body is what it sounds like it is. It's, you know, the majority of the organ. It contains that hollow cavity that we looked at, okay, which is just the hollow inside. The isthmus is that constriction between the body and the cervix, and the cervix is about the lower 1/3 of the uterus that projects into the proximal portion of the vagina. Cervix contains cervical glands, secretes mucus into the vagina, contains the cervical canal, and the internal os is the external opening, and the the internal os is the internal opening into the cavity, and then the external os is the external opening into the vagina. So the layers of the uterine wall are the same as what we saw with the fallopian tube. The inner layer, known as the endometrium, this is the layer that we say is the epithelial layer, and it's simple columnar epithelium. But it's on this bed of loose connective tissue known as the lamina propria. And that's a very generic name, so you're going to see in the class that we talk a lot about the lamina propria as this, bed of connective tissue that's right below the epithelial tissue. And I'm going to show you a picture of this. So the endometrium is divided into what's called the stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis. The stratum basalis is basically like the foundational layer. Okay, it always stays in the uterus, and it will regrow the uterus into a thicker layer, preparing for implantation, and that thicker layer is known as the stratum functionalis. So the stratum functionalis is this part that becomes thicker, more vascular, more glandular. It's going to respond to hormones and prepare for implantation, but if implantation does not occur, it's the stratum functionalis that's shed as menstrual flow. So that's the inner lining. The middle layer, called the myometrium, is a thick wall of smooth muscle. Like we've been mentioning, it's very, very muscular organ. And then the perimetrium is just the visceral peritoneum. Okay, so that's the connective tissue coat. So I'm going to jump to my PowerPoint here because I wanted to show you the wall of the uterus. And so let's take a look at this picture. These are pictures from our book. When you say it's simple columnar, that might be confusing because I know you understand that simple means a single layer of cells, right? So how can, a single layer of cells get thicker and thicker in the uterus? And so that the simple columnar technically is this yellow tissue that they're drawing right on this outer edge, okay? And so it's a single layer of tall cells. But all of this area, and right up until you get to the muscle, okay, and the muscle is what they're drawing kind of linear down here. So this is the myometrium, that's the muscular part. All the rest of this tissue is loose connective tissue that's known as the lamina propria. Okay, so the lamina propria is all this loose connective tissue. And so when the uterus gets thicker, it's the lamina propria technically that's growing thicker, and you can see how the blood supply gets richer. These glands become secretory, and so it's not really the epithelial tissue itself that gets thicker. It's the lamina propria that gets thicker with the rich blood supply and the uterine glands. So what we do is we divide the endometrium into two regions, and you can see in our textbook they're using kind of like a color difference, or you know what, let me grab the highlighter. Do you see how it's like a little bit darker pink in here? And so this bottom layer, this bottom region of the endometrium, this is what we would call the stratum basalis. And the stratum basalis always stays put, that never gets shed. So in other words, with menstrual flow, what would leave would be all the rest of this. It would, all the stratum functionalis would go. But what would stay would be the bottoms of these uterine glands, and so they'll regrow. You know, once the endometrium starts growing thicker, you'd still have the blood supply. You know, it's just not as branching out. So you just have like that minimal tissue. So that's what's known as the stratum basalis, and the rest of the endometrium is the stratum functionalis. So jumping back to the notes, the vagina is the muscular tube that connects the uterus to the outside of the body, also known as the birth canal, and it surrounds the it surrounds the cervix. Cervix projects into the vagina. And I'm going to switch back to the model to show you what I'm talking about. Let's hide that. Okay, and so let's ghost. Let's make the uterus solid. Let's ghost the vagina. And so there's what I'm talking about. So a lot of people think sometimes that the cervix is just this area of the uterus that is exposed in the vagina, but it's actually this whole lower region of the uterus, and it does project into the vagina. And here you can see this area that is kind of surrounding Oop, I didn't want the line. I'm not used to annotating on this tool. Sorry about that. Oops. You know, like, so this region, that's what's known as the fornix. So the fornix is this area of the vagina that's surrounding where the cervix is projecting into. So vagina is made up of the same 3 layers that we saw with the tube, with the uterine tubes and the uterus. The inner layer is going to be stratified squamous epithelium, non-keratinized. Overgrowth of that tissue, overgrowth of that tissue that projects into the vaginal opening, that is what is the hymen. Smooth muscle in the middle, and then adventitia, which is just the connective tissue outside. And so let me pull up a picture from my PowerPoint. Okay, so taking a look at this mid-sagittal section, you can see the uterus, you can see the fundus tipping forward, you can see the cervix projecting into the vagina, and you can see a little bit. So this epithelial tissue, the stratified squamous, what happens is it grows into the entrance of the vagina, the orifice, and that's what's known as the hymen, which gets damaged by physical activity, sexual activity, that kind of thing. Okay, so as far as external genitalia, since we're looking at this mid-sagittal section, let's take a look at that. So here's the vaginal opening, and then you can see the urinary bladder is anterior to that. So here's the front of the person, right? Here's the urethra. Okay, this is the urethral opening. And the vaginal and urethral openings open into a space known as the vestibule. The vestibule is surrounded by 2 folds of skin called the labia minora. Okay, so here we can see one because we're looking at a mid-sagittal section. Labia minora is encased by another fold of skin, labia majora. The most anterior structure of the vulva, which is the collective term for all of the external structures, is the clitoris. And so you might recall from the male reproductive system that this is that blue bumpy depiction is how they showed erectile tissue, and actually this is erectile tissue that regresses back, and this would have formed into the penis had the person developed into a male. Labia majora would have developed into the scrotum. And if that's interesting, you can take a look in our book. There's a section on development that compares male and female, and that's not in my notes, but it's interesting to take a look at that. Okay, so those are, that's the mid-sagittal section. Let me show you superficial anatomy. Okay, so mons pubis is just a fat pad right in front of the pubic symphysis, and that is what extends back as labia majora. Labia majora are the folds of skin that enclose all the other female external structures. Labia minora are the folds inside of that, and inside of labia minora, this area, this space, is known as the vestibule. Vaginal opening is posterior, urethral opening anterior to that, and then clitoris anterior to that. The perineum is outlined here in a dotted line, and that is just a region that goes from basically the pubic symphysis to the coccyx to, you might remember, the ischial tuberosities from AP1. And so that's a region where procedures are done for childbirth and so on. And so I'm going to jump back to my notes. Okay, and in my notes, I talk about the vulva being the name for everything, basically, consisting of the mons pubis, labia majora, inside of labia majora, labia minora. Oh, I forgot to mention this. I'm glad I looked at this. Greater vestibular glands are analogous to the Cowper's or bulbourethral glands in a male. They secrete mucus into the vestibule. Remember, the vestibule is just the space inside of labia minora. So it keeps that mucous membrane moist, and it also is responsive to sexual stimulation, just like Cowper's glands. Clitoris is the erectile tissue that's anterior to the union of the labia minora. The urethral orifice is the opening to the urethra, which is anterior to the vaginal orifice, the vaginal opening. And then we looked at the perineum, the region that contains the vulva. Okay, so it's pubic arch. Pubic symphysis is what I mentioned, is the actual joint. You probably remember that from AP1. Compared to pubic arch would be the union of the two, and it's the landmark that's right there, formed by the right and left pubic bones in the pubic symphysis. So that's where we're going to stop, and I'm going to post another video about hormonal regulation. Thank you.